Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Sonic Live broadcast for this Monday in July, and it's really wonderful to have you with us, and also maybe you've joined us later on Reels, and we really appreciate that too. This is our Back to the Roots broadcast, and pretty free-form discussion usually about being concerned with how connected are we to the roots of yoga when we do what we would call practicing yoga in a yoga studio principally, and also some stuff that we tend to do at home, especially through the virtual world that has become so popular starting from the pandemic onwards and is remaining popular, and I think that's amazing. But what is it that we're doing, and how connected are we to the roots of this practice and the original intentions of this practice, but most importantly, the potential power of this practice. Like, are we actually getting close to being able to realize our potential through this practice, which is entirely what this practice is about. This practice is, from its beginnings, concerned with an awareness and a connection to our purest, most essential self, our eternal self. Another way that it's sometimes worded very loosely is to be absolutely connected at all times to universal consciousness, to a knowing, to a ability, to being constantly guided by our intuition and being able to rely wholly on our intuition because of that awareness of how connected we are to quite literally everything. And that also includes going backward and forward in time. Wow. So it's a really, really powerful practice. And in the West, the practice has popularly been sort of like whittled down into most people seeing it as only a practice that's physical, just simply doing physical exercises, which we call yoga postures or asana, if we're going to use the Sanskrit term. And asana, or the postures, is a very, very powerful practice, and it can lead to many energetic shifts in our way that our mind works, our connection to spirit, etc. That can certainly happen. But is it happening? Because the thing is, if we're going to approach asana that way and look to gain everything through asana, which as a hatha yoga teacher I actually believe is possible, it really matters very greatly what our intentions are when we practice asana. And in the West, when we practice yoga postures, we often get into areas where we're basically thinking and behaving in the ways that we are always thinking and behaving, even though we're on the mat and in a yoga class. We're competing with others. We are feeling maybe that we would like to be more like someone else rather than find our highest potential. We're kind of looking at others and wishing we were them or wishing we were more like them. So our thoughts are really outside of ourselves, and our thoughts are on things which are comparisons, which are almost never fair, because we don't know all the way back in someone's experience that kind of led them to where they are today. So some of the comparisons we make with others are entirely unfair to ourselves, and often unfair to the person we're comparing ourselves to as well. And another thing about group yoga classes, which are so popular, is that they can turn into essentially you just doing sort of a vaguely esoteric form of calisthenics. So certainly worse things you can be doing. But again, are we really realizing the potential of this powerful practice if that's the only thing that we're looking at? And then as far as the virtual world and even concerns of meditation, what we're often doing is relying entirely on others to take care of this for us. So people are getting more into meditation, mindfulness, and something that is now being called breath work, though for millennia that's been referred to as pranayama. There's nothing new about breath work, though this is a very recent fad for people to be very interested in it. So even if we're doing things like breath work and mindfulness and feeling that we might be practicing meditation, what we're often doing is just switching on an app or switching on a broadcast like this and having someone guide us through something. Often during whatever exercise it is, we're still pretty close to being as distracted and preoccupied as we usually are, but since we've taken ourselves into this other world for a few moments, we do tend to feel good about that, and that's good. Again, worst things you could be doing, it's just that we're not realizing how powerful we are and how much command we can have over this practice, and how we can be really our own agents for self-development through the practice of yoga. So Something that Lauren and I started recently in this little series, just to get it a little more focused over the long summer months, is to talk about the 8 limbs of classical yoga as laid out by a figure named Patanjali, a very, very powerful figure in the practice of yoga, which has a history that spans thousands of years. So he's one of the very few people that we are still know by name and are drawn to his very specific teachings, because they basically codified how the yoga practice works and where our study of yoga and study of self should begin, and then where it ends up going in a really a very systematic way. So again, these are the 8 limbs of Patanjali's yoga, and a couple weeks ago we covered the first section, which is going to be basically, they're known as the yamas. They're sometimes called restraints. I like to think of them as basically behaviors that you're doing now, perhaps, that you would like to stop doing. So anything that's a negative behavior, a bad behavior that is not serving you and certainly would not be serving others and bringing a lot of negative energy into your life, those things can be brought under control and stopped altogether. And we would want to start with that, with modifications of behaviors that are currently not optimal. So those are not harming, not stealing, not lying, not being promiscuous, and also not hoarding. So we can all understand very easily why we'd want to stop doing, stealing, lying, hoarding, being promiscuous, of course. And the discussion goes deeper than that, certainly, because there's some things where we are actually involved in those behaviors, but we might not necessarily see that. We might not necessarily realize that a certain thing that we're doing, like taking credit for someone else's work, is a form of stealing. That's in our reels. We have that discussion saved forever if you want to check that out. It's just 2 back from this one. And then above that, we get into the Niyamas, which are the observances. So once we have dispelled and dissipated and moved beyond bad behaviors, we want to start looking to how we can engage more and more often in optimal behaviors. So these are very elevated practices, and these are practices that we can do every day and every action that we take, including how we go to sleep and how we wake up. This is just something that's like constantly something that we can be mindful of. But in constantly being mindful of these things, we also find that they actually become our habits and they become our viewpoint. And the habits start to build on themselves because we feel how positive they are. We see the effects on others when we're being mindful of these modifications and elevating our way of moving through this world. And so it tends to take on a momentum of its own and becomes not so much a chore or something that we have to be always mindful of, but something that we are then aware of, and happily and easily so. So there's these behavior modifications. Then above that, we have the yoga practices, which we all know very well, which are yoga poses. That's asana. Above that, we have pranayama. This is today called breath work. And then above that, we have the withdrawal of senses, the ability to focus. This leads to meditation, real meditation, not listening to an app for a few minutes, but real meditation. And then above that, we find ourselves in a state of yoga, in this state of connectivity and awareness to our optimal highest self, or in that state of awareness and connectivity to universal consciousness. I would argue these are 2 ways of saying exactly the same thing. Okay, so let's get back to niyamas. Last week we talked about the concept of saucha, which loosely defined simply means cleanliness. Lauren Hanna, the founder of Sonic Yoga, took us through that practice last week very thoroughly, so I encourage you to look back on that. It's really, the practice of cleanliness is much deeper and more expansive than most of us are thinking that it is. So, very interesting topic. The next one on the list is Santosha. So, Santosha means contentment. Hello, I'm waving at one of my friends here. So, Santosha is the practice of contentment. Now, this to me is like getting right into the heart of the difference, broadly speaking, of obviously, of the Western mind versus the Eastern mind. In the Western mind, we certainly are aware of the word contentment or the concept of contentment, but what contentment tends to mean to Westerners, especially those who are not necessarily practicing a lot of yoga or, getting into a lot of philosophical text, contentment usually is seen as a result. So if you have things that you want and that other people value, then you can decide, hey, I'm very content because I have a very good job and I have a roof over my head and I have my health and I'm in a great relationship and I have children, or whatever it is. Whatever the desires that needed to be met, if they become met and you are embodied in this like abundance that's obvious and definable and that others would agree is abundant, then we feel like, hey, we're content. But really, in the Eastern perspective and in a far older perspective, the practice of contentment is just that. It's a practice of being in a state of full acceptance of what is. And it's also a way of shifting the perspective on things to something that is far less judgmental. So, in other words, rather than looking at our circumstances needing to be a certain way for us to be content, rather what we're doing is looking at our circumstances regardless of what they might be, regardless of how much we might have or not have, regardless of what might be missing, and regardless of struggles that we might be going through, we're nevertheless going to practice contentment. So this is perhaps, practically speaking, the most important practice in yoga, to be in a state, in a place of complete. So the root words of Santosha are sam, which means complete, and then tosha means acceptance. So we're in a state of complete acceptance of our circumstances, not looking back with regret, not looking at others and wondering, why don't I have that? Why do they have that and I don't have that? I'm a good person, I deserve it. Why am I in these struggles? Like that kind of a thing is something that we all fall prey to, I'm sure, very, very often. We're only human, and when we're involved in struggles or when we're lacking something that we feel we need or deserve, it's very natural to feel unhappy and discontented over that state, obviously, so it's not something that is so easy to do. Nevertheless, it's incredibly important to reconsider some of these things, because I think what we're really looking at, really at the end of the day, when we're looking at what yoga is, do we practice yoga? Have we achieved a state of yoga? Which, by the way, that's exactly what yoga is. Yoga is a state. Yoga is not an activity. It's a state. It's a state of union with universal consciousness, a state of union with your highest self. So to be in that state, if you really simplify it and distill it to something a little more tangible, if you will, that state is a state of presence, absolute presence. So we're not thinking back. What should have gone a different way? What you should have that someone else has, and where did that go wrong? And what were my mistakes, and what can I do differently so I have that thing? Or looking ahead, I'll be happy when I have this. Things will be okay when this happens, etc. When we're thinking in that way, we're always in the past or in the future. And honestly, usually I believe that we're in both places at once, which creates a heck of a lot of anxiety. We're in this place of looking backward, which unfortunately can often lead to regret. We're also in this place of looking ahead at what we think sort of needs to happen, or we're perhaps even dreading what we know or what we feel we know may happen. And so in doing so, we're really robbing ourselves of this moment, which is the only moment that we really, really have, which is the present moment. And to be truly present, it's very easy to say, but it's very, very difficult to do. And I mentioned meditation earlier. A state of meditation, there's the practice of meditation where we might sit down and eliminate any extraneous sounds that we're able to, and maybe have very low lighting, and hopefully we're in a decent posture while we're sitting down, and we close our eyes and we lay our hands down on our lap or palms facing up, and maybe make a little mudra with our hands, right? And so we're attempting to meditate, which is good. But it's not the same thing as being in a state of meditation, which is challenging, elusive, and it also is a daily practice. It's something that we really have to continue to tend to. However, These 8 limbs of classical yoga, Patanjali's classical yoga, are all designed to set the table so that we are more readily able to enter and reside in this state of meditation, which again is synonymous really with a state of being present, truly, truly present. So when we are looking at contentment as a practice, like what could that perhaps look like? So one of the things we can do as a practice is to try to first see and then move away from all of these assumptions that we're making. We make assumptions all day long. We assume what people think of us. We assume how people view us and how people take us and how that's to our advantage or our disadvantage. We assume when someone behaves a certain way, perhaps that if something's been harmful to us, that they meant to harm us. And there's a very different scale of injury, if you will, if someone inadvertently harmed you or if someone meant to harm you. So we do ourselves a great deal of harm by sort of assuming that the things that happen to us almost are revolving around us. And so that if we have been harmed, someone intentionally harmed us, or with sort of depraved indifference harmed us. And it's possible that neither of those are true. And there's a concept in yoga philosophy which is common, and there's so many branches of yoga philosophy, but one of the common themes that you'll find in many branches of yoga philosophy is that whatever you're seeing, whatever you're experiencing in your life is actually a mirror of you, of yourself, of your behaviors, of your thought patterns. So if someone is behaving in a way that you find disturbing, the answer to that is not to try to change them or address what they've done. Actually, the answer is to look within and try to understand why that kind of behavior is being reflected back on you. So in one sense, it's a very difficult thing to keep in mind, because it keeps putting responsibility for the events in our lives back in our own laps, and that can feel very, very heavy, and I think it can also feel actually rather lonely. However, if one is practicing real, full acceptance of circumstances and really trying to move away from assumptions, not only does it keep us in a state of greater presence more and more often, but I think what we'll find is that though it's a very different and perhaps very unfamiliar way of looking at things, the more we look at things this way, the more we find kindred spirits among us, people who look at things the same way, people who are following a similar path that you are following. And when we see it that way, I think we find that we're moving into a way of being, regardless of our job, regardless of how we were brought up, regardless of the conditions that we're battling this day and probably tomorrow. And we're living in a way that is elevated just through a shift in perspective, just through a conscious attempt to shift our perspective into acceptance of what is, and also releasing assumptions. Another thing is that we try to control pretty much everything around us, everything that we see that's kind of within our reach and affecting us, we're attempting to try to control it. The thing is that it's usually the case that you can control almost none of that, really almost none of it. The attempt to control things is bringing a lot of anxiety, and a lot of the reason that it's bringing so much anxiety is because these things not only are out of our control, but paradoxically, if we release control from events around us, they sort of fall in line. They sort of fall into a place where it seems like the road is appearing right in front of our feet as we take each step if we relinquish control. So that's really certainly a matter of state of mind, but it's also a matter of perspective. It starts with, can I control this? If the answer is no, and if you think about it long enough, you may agree that the answer is almost always going to be no, that you can't control other people and other circumstances, then what we find is that we feel a lot lighter. We feel immediately more content because, we're not going to keep attempting to wrestle with these things in our mind and think that we're going to change them when there's no chance of that happening. And yet, it can sound a little bit like we're sort of giving up. We are giving up, but in giving up, it's more, I think a better word for it is a a surrender into this idea that you're just going to go along with the flow of things. You're just going to fall into the flow of where the water is running or where the wind is blowing, and just let it carry you, and have a little more faith that it will carry you into a place that is wondrous beyond your current imagination, perhaps. Because I think we can all agree, if we think about it a little bit, this life that we're living, this existence that we have, is so profoundly inexplicable, amazing, that if we get more and more into that awareness as a practice, we find more contentment, and the circumstances are incidental. They're simply incidental. So that's my little spiel on the practice of contentment. And I think that the key takeaway from this discussion is that it's just that. Contentment is a practice. It's not a result. The Western mind sees contentment as a result. The Eastern mind, where the yoga traditions come from, is seeing this as a practice. All right? It's really wonderful. Oh, thank you. Someone gave me a little heart. So it's really wonderful to have spent this time with you today. And you can always watch these in replay on Reels. Most often I'm here with the Sonic founder, Lauren Hanna. Sometimes, like today, I'm solo because she had an appointment. But we'll be here one way or another every Monday at 12:30, and currently talking about the classical 8-limbed path of yoga as laid out by Patanjali. My name is Keith. Come see me at Sonic Yoga. Come see me at Sonic Yoga. It's not hard. You can even do it virtually. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.